42nd episode, though I think only the third virtual one, of the Mogcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Good morning, Jacob. How are you?
I'm very well, Paul, thank you, and I hope you're well and not finding lockdown too onerous.
I'm very well. Lockdown proceeds as it does, and I have been startled in my lockdown existence by the arrival of an article yesterday from Michael Fabricant, your colleague, who wrote on his site that he rarely disagrees with Andrew Jimson. Even more rarely does he disagree with Jacob Rees-Mogg, but he has a different view to you about the return of the House of Commons.
Yes, and I understand why people have a different view, because the virtual House of Commons has been an amazing technological achievement, and the small team within the House of Commons has worked wonders to get it up and running so quickly and to have it doing what it's doing. But it isn't the House of Commons as we need for the country to be governed, scrutinised, and for legislation to be passed. So what has been done is remarkable, but it simply isn't a proper parliament doing its job. So that's the sort of key, is that actually the House of Commons physically working, fully working, is essential. And I know ministers reeling off endless statistics can be a little tiresome, but in the week of the 2nd of March, we had 600 minutes of debate on everything, against 389 minutes in the hybrid parliament the week of the 11th of May. And if you look at the primary legislation in the chamber, in addition to the other general debate, we had 648 minutes discussing primary legislation against 216 minutes, double the amount of time. Not only is it crucial the government gets its legislative programme through, on which it has a mandate from the British people, but it's also crucial that that legislation is scrutinised. And we had double the scrutiny time physically as opposed to the hybrid. And so people saying it doesn't really matter if Parliament doesn't sit so much and it was all fine, I just think are wrong. I think we are not doing the job of Parliament, which is an essential job. The country needs to have its democratic arms working.
Let's just go back to the last Mogcast, which I opened with 3 questions about this very matter. They were about the lack of ability to make an intervention, to raise points of order and to come in on questions. And you made it very plain you weren't entirely happy about the virtual parliament, but it was the best thing that we'd got. What moved your mind on between, in some ways, defending the position, which you were bound to do as a minister when we last spoke, and your passionate expression of unhappiness with the present situation at business questions just last week?
Well, what we have lost is very important, and we did discuss that a bit before, that the mood of the House is crucial to how our system works, that the crucible of debate, the system of testing ideas to see whether they're any good or not. If a minister gives a weak argument, that is exposed when the chamber has people in it, because you can just tell that the argument hasn't succeeded. In a virtual parliament, a minister can just say what he or she wants to say, and there's no comeback. What changed? First of all, what I said to you in the last podcast was genuine. I was, of any minister, most intimately involved with introducing the hybrid system, and I'm actually, although I don't think it's perfect, I think what the House authority has achieved is really very remarkable. I'm quite proud of what they achieved, and wouldn't want to imply by the desire to go back to physical that I don't think that what was anything other than a great piece of work. But I thought that we had to move with the country at large, and that, frankly, the opposition like having a hybrid parliament, because what is the opposition there to do? It's there to stop the government getting things done. And it was willing to sacrifice a degree of scrutiny to stymie the government's programme. And the idea that we should be asking schools to go back, but that the House of Commons either shouldn't be seen as being essential and therefore it doesn't matter one way or another, or that MPs shouldn't be willing to take the same steps as school teachers, seem to me unreasonable.
The claim from the opposition and some of Labour's supporters, of course, is that you're desperate for the massed ranks of Tory MPs to come back in the chamber because Keir Starmer is winning every PMQs against Boris Johnson and he needs as much support as possible.
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? It's a completely trivial point, irrelevant to the main substance, which is that you're not getting proper scrutiny or a legislative programme through, and Keir Starmer loses. The idea that sort of a Perry Mason approach to parliamentary scrutiny of taking one sentence out of a letter, hanging your hat on that, it may convince a jury in a TV series, but it didn't convince the British public because they saw that the Prime Minister was right and that Sir Keir, the nervous knight, was wrong.
The nervous knight being a reference to, I'm sorry, I usually get your references as with Perry Mason.
Oh, he seems nowadays quite diffident about using his knighthood.
I'd forgotten.
There was a jolly piece in the Mail on Sunday pointing this out, which was quite funny, about how he initially registered as Sir Keir with the House authorities and decided to drop the knighthood more recently.
So the more substantial point is that with all this shortage of time, the government simply can't get as much of its legislation through as it would wish. And that's an important reason from the executive's point of view for wanting Parliament to come back in its full form.
Yes, but it's also slightly more pious than that, because there's a great article by Jess Phillips, who regular listeners will know is a Labour politician I both like and admire, and genuinely not in the sort of formulaic way one sometimes is obliged to say those sorts of things. And she wrote a piece for The Independent saying that she's not a traditionalist, but that she recognises that a hybrid parliament doesn't allow for proper scrutiny. And I think governments benefit from proper scrutiny. I think better decisions are made when there is good scrutiny and MPs are able to make their points effectively. I think that develops and aids policy. But yes, the government has a mandate from the British people to deliver on a manifesto presented last December. In addition to that, it has legislation relating to the coronavirus crisis, which needs to be passed, but passed properly. The emergency coronavirus legislation was passed in a couple of days, and that's perfectly proper when an emergency strikes. But that's not a proper way to legislate generally. You need to have the hours of debate to consider things, and to fit all that in with a virtual parliament was simply not going to be possible.
Just two more questions on this. The substance of Michael Fabrican's argument was that you can either have, at the moment, a virtual parliament with all members participating, or you can have a real-life one with only some, because the chamber is only taking 47 MPs at a time. Therefore, if everyone comes back, MPs can't all come into the chamber to ask questions or participate in debates.
Michael knows that the chamber's not built to contain all MPs, never has been. That you never have every MP in the chamber. You always have a number. Most days, most proceedings would, you will remember from your time as an MP, 50 MPs in the chamber is a reasonable attendance. But you can have people rotating their attendance in the chamber, which is actually what happens anyway. And with a very minor flexing of the rules, you can ensure any MP who wants to get in a statement can. And historically, the rule has been that if you're not in from the beginning of a statement, you can't ask a question on it. But that's at the Speaker's discretion. And so you can have a system where you have 50 MPs going through and that they are all able to ask the questions they need to ask, and that the chamber is as full as normal for the course of a debate.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there and try to broaden this conversation out from Parliament into the coronavirus and the situation more regularly. Now, the government's central policy now seems to me to be a test and trace policy. You test lots of people, you have trackers who follow up their contacts, get them tested, you quarantine people if necessary, and you roll this program out gradually across the country. And when you do that, you're going to have a much better idea of what local R rates are. In other words, how fast the coronavirus is expanding in different places and among whom. Therefore, wouldn't it be sensible over the medium term to have a more regional or local approach to the lockdown, whereas places are unlocked or locked up according to what their local R rate is?
The theory behind that you are proposing is not one without merit. The difficulty is the size of the country, isn't it? That we are a relatively small country geographically, when travel is fairly easy, and it would be quite difficult, I think, to operate a regional lockdown merely as a matter of practicality.
Were one in the places that were being unlocked more rapidly, so to speak, were one to keep hotels closed and restaurants closed and basically tourist communities closed, but to unlock as much of the working economy as possible, might that not be practicable?
Inevitably, different parts of the economy will unlock at different rates. That's already been set out by the government. But in terms of doing this on a regional basis or a localized basis, don't you, if you're living in Hampshire, just go into the neighbouring county? Or if you're living in Somerset, you go to Dorset. We don't have any physical demarcations that would make it obvious that you were in a particular area. How small would you make the zones? Would you make them the relatively arbitrary regions that we've got? It's perhaps you could do it in a city because people know either they live in the city or not. But even so, on the margins of the city, how would you enforce it and stop them going into the local countryside, or people from the countryside coming in if the restaurants had opened in the city? So I think the size of the country makes that quite hard to do.
You think the balance of the argument is against such a solution?
Well, I don't want to go that far. I see why you may want to do it, and I see that things could develop in such a way that it was a sensible thing to do. So I don't want to say this could never happen. There is just a very obvious problem with it in a small but heavily populated country.
In which case it follows that the whole convoy is going to move at roughly the speed of the slowest ship, doesn't it, so to speak? You can't unlock any particular area because of the difficulties of people moving around that you describe.
Well, I suppose the counter to that is that you can look at the country as a whole, but it does come back to the government's 5 tests, and are they being met, and are they being met for the country at large? And if they are, you can open up. But that if you've got contact testing and you know who is infected and they are quarantining themselves, then wherever you are in the country, you're reducing the R rate, aren't you?
So until or unless there's a vaccine or very effective antibody tests and we discover that people can't catch the virus a second time, or herd immunity is achieved, until or unless any of these things happen, it does look like being a long haul, doesn't it, with a virus we're going to have to live with rather than one we can conquer.
What I think you're seeing is the way people are behaving is as important in determining this as anything that governments do. And I think we touched on this last time as well.
Yes, we did.
The lockdown was implemented as much as anything because that's what people wanted to do. And I think coming out of lockdown will evolve equally as that is what people want to do. That there have been relatively low levels of police enforcement. It's been done by consent. And I think that eases the return to some degree of normality because it has to go with the grain of what people are comfortable doing. And they will become more comfortable doing more things as time goes on prior to a vaccine.
Which leads me to ask, did the government overdo it? I mean, this message of stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, did that work more effectively than ministers had expected? I think from memory, the figure is that the government had expected 20% of children still to go to school. In fact, like 2% went. Have you been too successful in alerting the public to the dangers of the virus to the point where they've now got them out of proportion?
That's a bit like the question when you're interviewing people and you say to somebody, do you have a fault? And the person replies that my only fault is that I work too hard. If the government's only fault is that it's been too successful, I don't think that's a great fault. I think at the time the lockdown began, it was really, really important that the very rapid spread of the disease was brought to an end. And that happened, and that was a success. And that in a way, it's much easier to go into a lockdown than it is to come out of it, because coming out of it is a much more nuanced situation, and people have to make decisions for themselves. And so getting it down quickly and rapidly meant that the NHS could cope. If you think of what people were writing prior to the lockdown, they were saying, will there be ventilators available for anybody aged over 80? That never happened. We never got to the situation where care had to be rationed. Anyone who needed emergency care received it. And I think that's very, very important for the country, psychologically as well as morally.
On this question of confidence, I mean, very clearly there's a strong argument for a phased reopening of schools. It's noticeable that David Blunkett, Alan Johnson, and I'd add even Barry Shearman have suggested that the position of the teaching unions is unreasonable. But if you are a anxious parent who's worried about the virus, and of course people within a certain frame should be, how do you deal with the question that if you're expecting young primary school children, reception children to go back, how do you deal with the question of how on earth you maintain social distancing in schools with very young children who like to run about all over the place?
You recognise that you can't, and therefore you take other steps. So you have 15 to a classroom, you have only one teacher in the classroom, and you stagger the arrival times so that you have specific groups who are with a teacher rather than a lot of intermingling. But this is so important that children get back to school. The IFS report today is pointing out what the problem is, that children are in affluent families are getting 75 minutes a day of extra education. And that is a risk for the most deprived children, that they are not getting education that will affect all their life chances. So with steps that minimise the risk, that are proportionate and keep teachers safe. And there's lots of arguments about school children and indications that they are at very, very low risk themselves, but that they're not spreaders of the disease in the same way as adults. And that's not proved, but it's something that there seems to be some indication of. Getting children back to school is really very important.
Just finally, a wild card question of politics altogether. I mean, obviously, with the virtual parliament, you've been very busy trying to make it all work, but there have also been periods in which parliament's not been sitting and we're coming up to another recess. What have you been reading during lockdown?
Oh, what have I been reading? I've been reading some books that I've had on my bookshelves for ages and have thought that I ought to read. And so I read an absolutely fascinating book given to me, 10 or 15 years ago on Alexander Pope's politics and how he expressed them. And I'm currently reading a book on the Black Death and how that affected people. And
it's not Ben Gummer's book, by any chance?
No, so it's an older book. It's from the 1960s, drawing on the previous work of Cardinal Gasquet, who actually did a lot of work on it in the late 19th century. And I always have a P.G. Wodehouse on the go.
Pope, as I think the name might indicate, was a Catholic, was he not?
He was indeed, yes, and that was very important to him and helped form a lot of his political thinking and activity. He was a great hero. He was a great hero of my father's. And probably the 18th century figure my father was most interested in.
The Rape of the Lock and all that.
Indeed, yes.
Well, I'm looking forward to being able to discuss all this with you in the next Mogcast. Who knows, by then we may be able to meet in person rather than
nice.
Carrying on in this virtual form. But at any rate, thank you once again, Jacob, for another Mogcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Mogcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
We say, and I ask you to say with us, lift up your voices in this great meeting in the heart of England, and to all